Good morning, everyone. Happy to see you here. One more week till spring break, and hope you're excited about the exam on Friday. It's the next to last exam in this course, so exam number three, a chance to pull up your grade because remember, only 2 out of 3 exams are going to count towards the final grade, and there's going to be the last exam is going to be a final exam. So, uh, what do we have for today? So, for today, I'm going to finish up the lecture on preserving biodiversity, and I am going to start on the exam review. So, because the study guide has not been available, it is ready now, and Ansley will post it today. So I'm going to get you started on the review, and on Wednesday, please prepare your questions regarding the study guide. So go over the study guide, and Wednesday is going to be a question and answer session, basically. Okay, no prepared slides, just question and answers. Great. So with that, let me switch to slides here. Uh, Just a reminder, we still have this quiz 11 that is available and is due on April 7th, on this Wednesday, the day after tomorrow. And I'm not going to even mention anything about quiz 12 because it's going to be due after spring break, so don't worry about it over the spring break. Okay, where's my laser pointer?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of a stupid question, but is there any way I can move my exam on Friday so I can get my vaccine?
Hmm. I do you have an appointment for that specific time?
Yeah, it's the only appointment, and I have to drive an hour.
Well, send me the confirmation of the appointment, and we'll arrange a makeup exam.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So last time on Friday we ended on the greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases warm Earth's surface, and greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide is the big one, which we emit lots and lots of every year. Due to fossil fuel burning. Apart from CO2, there is another greenhouse gas called methane, which is emitted in industrial setting as well as natural settings, such as wetlands are emitting lots of methane, and as I mentioned before, cow farts are a big source of methane to the atmosphere. So this graph, this graph represents the link between, or visual link between the increase in CO2, in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time, and the changes, the fluctuation in the average temperature. Well, it says temperature anomaly, so fluctuation in the temperature anomaly over the course of the years. And you can see that the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has been increasing exponentially. And temperature has become, the climate conditions have become warmer as well. So again, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and and it contributes to elevated temperatures around the globe. And the greenhouse gas is a gas that traps heat, that does not allow heat to escape out of the system. So in the case of the Earth, if we view Earth as a semi-closed system, then the heat that is coming in from the sun, it is reflected from the Earth's surface back to the atmosphere. But the layer of the greenhouse gases, they do not allow the trapped heat to escape. Some of it escapes, but not a lot. If we did not have the greenhouse gas layer around the Earth, we would have a bad time because the temperatures would fluctuate much, much more drastically than they do now. Temperatures at night would be much, much lower than we have now, and temperatures during the day would be much, much, much higher. So the greenhouse gases are not entirely bad, but as with any substance, too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. So too much of CO2 in the atmosphere becomes bad because it changes temperature, and changing temperatures affect in turn lots and lots of other things, among one of which is the strength of rainfalls and the strength of the hurricanes and the frequency and severity of the hurricanes. Okay. So global climate change has severe consequences, and we see like an immediate example that has been very, very widely discussed is the reduction in the ice caps. So polar ice sheets are melting and sea levels are rising, and as a result, changing icy and aquatic ecosystems. So melting polar ice caps, well, the northern melting North Pole, I'll say that, is bad for these creatures right here because it's these guys it's their habitat. They depend on the ice sheets to survive, to hunt, to feed themselves, and melting ice caps are kind of making it hard for them to survive. So although we do not hunt the polar bears, okay, we don't do anything to directly contribute to their extinction. We Our day-to-day activities that contribute lots of CO2 into the atmosphere, they basically cause the melting of the ice sheets, which deprives these guys of the habitats. And this graph here, it shows the Arctic sea ice extent over the years, and you can see that it has been declining. There's certainly some variation, but the overall trend is clear and it is not good, meaning it's declining. So apart from changing temperature, and I'm just going to reiterate it again, the CO2 in the atmosphere, it changes the acidity of the oceans. So it apart from altering elevating Earth's temperature, it also makes oceans more acidic. And does anybody remember what's the consequence of more acidic ocean? Can you remember what it does to organisms? Anyone? So if the ocean is more acidic, remember I gave an example with the coral reefs. Coral reefs are built on calcium carbonate substrate. Okay, when the corals die, they turn into these calcium carbonate substrate on which new coral grow, and lots of other creatures inhabit there, hang out there, feed and breed and what have you. So whenever the ocean waters become, or any water becomes more acidic, acid eats away at calcium carbonate. So more acidic ocean means that coral reefs are degrading. The more acidic waters are eating away at the substrate on which coral grows. And because of that, the corals die out and corals are bleached, and because the corals are not viable anymore, the multiple organisms that depend on the corals, they die as well. Okay, so that's one other example of how acidity influences organisms. So apart from emitting greenhouse gases and changing Earth's climate and ocean chemistry, we have introduced lots of invasive species, which, well, I should say exotic species, which have become invasive and displaced native organisms. So an introduced species is brought by humans with a purpose or accidentally to an area where it did not previously occur. And sometimes a non-native species or exotic species spreads widely in its new habitat. When it breeds, it becomes invasive. So invasive species, basically the threshold after which species becomes invasive is if the new exotic species overtakes the habitat and suppresses other species, it is considered to be invasive. So again, new species is an exotic species or a non-native species, and if this new exotic non-native species becomes threatening to or starts out competing the native species, then it's considered to be invasive. So if you've driven along particularly I-40 highway through Arkansas, you could have seen like lots and lots of these guys on the sides of the road, and this is called a kudzu plant. Okay, it's a vine, and it's extremely invasive, and it's very widespread in the south. So originally, the kudzu was planted by farmers to kind of not, to preserve the soil. When the farmers did not plant the crops, they planted kudzu so that soil would not erode. Um, but now it's basically a nuisance because the kudzu felt too good in this new environment, and it overtook lots and lots of ecosystems. So the way it outcompetes other plants, it basically wraps around the trees and other plants that are on the ground, and preventing the access of sunlight to these plants. And if the plants do not have access to sunlight, they cannot photosynthesize and they die. So kudzu is literally overshading the native plants and thus outcompeting them. Um, Another example I can think of of an invasive species, which is fairly well known, is the case of rabbits in Australia. So rabbits were introduced to Australia. They're not native species to that region, and they were brought in by settlers for hunting. Well, that backfired because there were very few natural predators of rabbits there, and as a result, rabbits multiplied and became an invasive species. Now they're a nuisance. They're overgrazing, and if they're because they're overgrazing, they're destroying basically all the plants. And if there is no plants, the other species have nothing to feed on. So rabbits are kind of competing with the native species and making it hard for them to survive. And in this picture here, the bird that you see here is called a starling. And originally, it's not a native species to North America. It was introduced from Europe. So I want to say in the early 20th century, 60 starlings were brought to the North America, were brought to New York and released in Central Park. And it was done by people to kind of resemble the Europe, to get a European feel in New York, because starlings are widespread in Europe. But starlings that also backfired, and starlings basically multiplied, and now you can see them everywhere in the US. Like they are noisy, they poop, they damage crops, and they're a nuisance overall. So the lesson from all of this should be basically do not introduce exotic species into the wild, into the area. If you want to plant something exotic in your garden, maybe keep it indoors, and do not allow like the seeds to spread and the spores to spread, to prevent unforeseen circumstances, like with kudzu, like with starlings, like with rabbits in Australia. Okay. So another factor that threatens biodiversity is basically we hunt them. We overexploit the resources. So an overexploitation can drive species to extinction. So humans sometimes harvest a species faster than it can reproduce. For instance, we harvest a lot of predatory fish for food. We eat fish, and as a result of over harvesting of the predatory fish in the oceans, only 10% of big predatory fish left from what was originally in the ocean. Think about it. We've basically consumed 90% of the fish. And this is the reason why there are very strict regulations now on when you can fish and how much you can catch, how much you're allowed to take home with you, for recreational fishers as well as for commercial fishers. And so the way to kind of alleviate overfishing is farmed fish is a good alternative to that, because if you farm fish, you're you're raising it in artificial ecosystems, so it's not impacting the fish in the wild in any way, but you still have the benefit of consuming fresh fish. um, so whenever another big issue with the if as long as I'm still on the fish example, another big issue with the fishing is basically other animals that die in the nets that are cast by commercial fishers. And you can see the turtle here that it was caught in the net. So there were some there are some side effects from fishing, and like there is some damage to other organisms made by the fishing industry. So we have also overhunted these guys, the Bengal tigers, I believe. Yeah, the as a result of overhunting the Bengal tiger, it is now endangered, an endangered species at the risk of extinction. And it's been hunted for what is it called, fur or pelt? Um, and yeah, so the way we our everyday choices can prevent overexploitation, even though we individually may not overexploit resources, and we do not. One person, cannot overexploit a resource, but individual choices matter in contribution to this overexploitation aspect. For instance, if you choose to eat foreign fish over wild caught fish, you're contributing to reduction of over exploitation of the fish resource. Um, if you're if you switch if you don't buy ivory or don't buy furs that come from endangered animals, you're contributing to reduction of the demand of these products. And if there is no demand, there's not going to be a supply. Okay, so these are a couple of examples how we can contribute to reduction of overexploitation of the resources and maintaining biodiversity. So it's not all doom and gloom, and some of the damage that we have done to natural ecosystems can be alleviated. Some species can be recovered, and if we kind of if we are persistent and conscious and know that we're doing about species preservation, we can reverse the damage that we have done. And the example that is shown in this slide is basically the graph showing the recovery of the population of the bald eagles. Uh, and so the population of the bald eagles in the 60s became very, very low, and that was due to reduction of the habitat available to eagles for eagles to nest. But so thanks to the passing of the Endangered Species Act in 1970s, that prevented the habitat conversion and kind of creating new habitats for the bald eagle, the number of pairs or the population size has increased well in the recent year, in the end of the or beginning rather of the 21st century. It had started increasing exponentially. And in fact, Endangered Species Act was so great for the bald eagle population that in 2007 it was removed from the endangered species list. So it's not an endangered species anymore as of 2007. So through legislation, through informed science-based decision making, we can recover some of the damage done to the populations and biodiversity. So protecting and restoring habitats saves many species at once. So efforts to maintain and restore biodiversity include setting aside and protecting parks, wildlife refuges, and other natural areas. So restoration projects show that recovery, although costly and difficult, may reverse some species decline. And if all habitats cannot be restored, at least we need to provide ecological corridors across highways for wildlife to pass and not be killed by cars, or not to be restricted to one side of the road, for instance. So does anybody know what is pictured here? Does anybody know what is shown in this picture?
Is that the thing where the salmons go up?
Yep, it's a fish ladder. So the area here is basically what we don't see here is the actual dam, and the dam is constructed to harvest energy from the water. So there is a large pool of water on one side of the dam, and the water is let through these little holes in the dam, and the creating constant flow of water, which in turn turns the turbines, and the turning turbines produce electricity. But the drawback of the dam is that it cuts off access of fish upstream. So dams are built in the rivers, on the rivers, and if the fish could formerly move up and down the river, if the a dam is put on the river, the fish will not have access to the areas beyond up the dam. And to provide the access, in this particular example, people built the fish ladder. So the fish can jump from step to step to step to step, and they can still have access up the river despite the dam. So this is one of the engineering solutions that can be done to preserve diversity of the species, as well as preserve the population size of the particular fish of interest. So various conservation efforts could save individual species, and laws can protect individuals in the species from predators and poaching. And so the poaching and kind of hunting of exotic of species has been a large mm, it has contributed substantially to reduction in population sizes, particularly of these guys. And to kind of alleviate it, there was hunting and poaching because there was a demand for it. So local populations have it's a way for the local populations to make money, to go on safari and kind of kill the species and lead to which leads to species endangerment. And to kind of alleviate it, again, what would work is to either reduce demand on the safari, stop hunting animals, but and if that doesn't work, through legislature, like kind of people could ban it. But banning hunting kind of would take away the income from the local populations, which kind of depend on it. So instead, uh, alternative solution could be these photo hunts, meaning we don't kill animals, we just take pictures of them. So that our kids may enjoy it, and our grandkids may enjoy the same animals because they will, be maintained sustainably. Also, so this kind of photo hunts are called ecotourisms, and ecotourism is a potential solution or alternative for economic incentives to protect the species. And finally, biotechnology could bring back extinct species by cloning them. And so the drawback about that would be we can we can revive the species, but we cannot necessarily maintain it indefinitely because of lack of genetic diversity. So if we have some tissue sample with DNA, technically it's possible to clone it, but we are going to be stuck with that particular gene pool in that DNA. And as you should remember, genetic diversity is very important for the species to survive, because if there is no genetic diversity, then there's the probability of the species surviving when environmental conditions change reduces drastically. And finally, conserving biodiversity involves scientists and ordinary citizens. We like it's not very sustainable to just rely on scientists and legislators to conserve the species. Our everyday choices matter for preserving biodiversity. So as I mentioned today, like choosing farmed fish over wild caught fish contributes to preserving biodiversity. Um, what else did I mention today? Reducing your carbon footprint matters for the biodiversity. What I mentioned on Friday was basically be plan better on how, like, what you will eat during the day, because 30% of food ends up in trash, right? So if we put more effort into planning our meals and kind of really evaluating, becoming better at dosing our food, like portioning our food, and so that we do not throw out a lot of food and trash. So if we do not throw out a lot of food and trash, that means that the area of land that will be required for crops, it's going to shrink. Okay, because the demand drives the supply. If there is less demand, supply will also decrease. And if supply will decrease in the agricultural area, that means more land will be available for native species to live on. Okay, so that's it for the preserving biodiversity. What questions do you guys have about what I've covered so far?
So what do you think are the most important takeaways from this like lesson?
The most important takeaways are that we are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases and changing the climate. The changing climate affects biodiversity by this changing the environmental conditions, and not all species can adapt to new environmental conditions and they will die out. Some of the species, the warming climate changes the habit may change the habitats irreversibly, such as polar ice caps. If they melt, then the species that depend on polar ice caps, like polar bear in the North Pole, if there's no ice caps, there's going to be no polar bear as well, because that's the habitat for that particular species. CO2 also changes the chemistry of the ocean, changing the rate of reproduction of fish and other species inhabiting the ocean, and changing the habitats, like bleaching the corals and degrading the coral reefs. Um, well, I end up reiterating all the slides. So other takeaways is exotic species. Be careful with them. Do not kind of plant something in the wild if you brought it from somewhere else, because it can backfire and outcompete local species. And basically try and be more conscious, environmentally conscious when making choices in food, when making choices in maybe you haven't done this before, but maybe eventually you'll build a house. It matters what kind of materials you choose. It matters how you conserve energy within the house. The less energy you consume, the less greenhouse gases will be emitted, and so on. So there's a lot of takeaways from these slides, but these basically I'm trying to introduce these topics and make you think about ecosystems as a whole, not just urban ecosystems and ecosystem we exist in every day, but also introduce like how our everyday behavior affects Earth as a whole. Other questions?
So the exam is this Friday, right?
Yes.
So it's going to be on all of the weeks previous to this one, right?
The exam is going to be on topics, most of the topics starting from last exam. So we've covered we've covered evidence of evolution. We've covered forces of evolutionary change, population ecology, community ecology, and ecosystem ecology. And all of those topics will be covered on this upcoming exam.
Oh, but there will still be a final, right?
Yes, final will still be there, and final will cover everything.
Will we have like a review day?
Yeah, so on Wednesday, is going to be a review day. I will start review today, but on Wednesday, please bring your questions to the class. The Ensley will post the study guide today, and go over the study guide and bring the questions about the study guide here on Wednesday, and I'll address them. Alanis asks, will there be a review for the final? There will be a study guide for the final. Yes. I have to check the course schedule. I think there was a review for I'm not sure. Alanis, please check the schedule. I don't remember from the top of my head. And Sukyon, do you provide study guide for the exam? Yes. For the final, there will also be a study guide. The NL is the final cumulative. The final is going to be cumulative. Yes. So on everything, it's going to be comprehensive, basically on everything. Or what did you mean by that, NL? Did you mean the grade or the material covered on the final? Yeah, the material, it's going to be like everything is going to be covered in the final. Well, there will be a study guide, so you'll know. All right. Review. How long is module 6 going to take? A week. It's going to be a short one. The final study guide is not available yet, Alanis. There's still lots of time till final, and the final exam is not ready yet. So once it's ready, once I compose the exam, that's when the study guide will be posted. We're talking about exam 3 right now. So I was referring to study guide about exam 3. It will be posted today. Okay. So for the upcoming exam, exam number 3, there will be questions on Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. There will be questions on basically aimed at gauging your understanding what it is. And what Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a hypothetical situation in which allele frequencies do not change between generations. Okay, there will be questions gauge at your understanding, like what conditions have to be met within a population in order for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium to occur. So again, it's important to understand that this is a theoretical state of the population. It doesn't happen in real life. And the conditions that are needed for this theoretical equilibrium to occur is basically the mating needs to be random. And in real life, mating is rarely random, especially with sexual reproduction. There has to be no migration into and out of the population. There has to be no genetic drift, no mutations, which we know outright it's not happening. Mutations always occur. And there has to be no natural selection. So under these conditions, the frequencies of alleles will stay constant within a population over time. Okay, so this is Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and the conditions under which it occurs. Any questions about that? Great. So we can calculate allele and genotype frequencies, and there will be a question on the exam where I will ask you to calculate either a frequency of the genotype or the frequency of the allele. So what is the difference between allele frequencies and genotype frequencies? What is happening? Okay. Allele frequency is, how would you calculate the allele frequency? if you have a population of ferrets, which have two alleles per gene, two alleles of a particular gene, and you have like 10 individuals in a population, how would you calculate the allele frequency?
Wouldn't you calculate like all of, like, say it's big B, and big G, little g, and then little g and little g? Wouldn't you calculate, like, say you're trying to find the allular frequency of the dominance of big G? Wouldn't you count all the big G's and divide it by the total amount?
Yep, that's exactly right. So allele frequencies, you choose the allele of interest, like either, in this case, either capital D or lowercase d, and counts all the capital D's within the population, even if an individual has is homozygous dominant, you count these guys twice. This will be total of two alleles, okay? Two occurrences of a particular allele. And divide it by the total number of alleles within the population. So Joshua, I got it exactly right. Now, genotype frequencies are a bit more, there's some more math involved in here. So you can either calculate the genotype frequencies using the formula here, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared, where p and q are the frequencies of two alleles of a particular gene. And p squared basically is the frequency of homozygous dominant genotype. 2pq is the frequency of the heterozygous genotype, and q squared is the frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. Okay, so you can use the formula, or you can create a Punnett square crossing two heterozygous individuals and calculating the frequencies of the homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous individuals. So what questions do you guys have about this type of math and this type of these concepts, allele frequencies, genotype frequencies? Would you be able to calculate these guys if you saw a related assignment? Lauren asks, would you provide the Punnett square, or would we make it? You'd need to make it. I would provide only there will be either a picture or of a population with each individual having certain genotypes, or I will provide allele frequencies, and from the allele frequencies, you'd have to determine the genotype frequencies. Any other questions about this? Okay. So there will be question about various natural selection types. And there are three types. There is directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. So on questions of the exam, you will see some examples of natural selection, and you will need to identify which type of natural selection it is: directional, disruptive, or a stabilizing selection. So the differences between those are in the directional selection, there is, well, literally some direction in changes of the phenotypes and genotypes. So the example I gave in the lecture was basically if consider a forest and some moths that live on tree bark. if the forest has undergone succession, and the trees with lighter bark have changed to trees with darker bark, the the selection of moths will like the moths that will survive will basically have darker color to match the color of the bark, because if the color of the bark and if the color of the moth does not match the color of the bark, there is increased probability that the moth will be eaten by a predator. So if the phenotype or genotype is shifted towards basically different direction, it's called a directional selection. Now, disruptive selection is the selection that favors the contrasting phenotypes. The example I gave was basically the snails living on some rocks near a stream. And if the area flooded and new kinds of rocks were imported into the stream, the rocks may be not of uniform color, but of two contrasting colors. And the two contrasting colors of rock will cause the disruptive selection in the colors of the snails. So the light colored snails and dark colored snails will be more prevalent than the medium colored snails that were more prevalent before the change in the habitat, before the change in the habitat. And finally, the stabilizing selection is the kind of selection that narrows down the distribution, makes this bell-shaped curve more tight. The example I gave in class was with birth weight of babies. So the babies that are born too small or too large are prone to diseases, and basically have higher chance of not surviving, higher mortality rate or lower chance of surviving to the reproductive age. So as a result, over time, because these individuals do not survive long enough to reproduce, the less and less of small and large babies is going to be born, because medium sized babies are going to survive and reproduce, increasing the chances that over generations, more medium babies are going to be born. So as a result, we see the tightening of the bell-shaped curve. Does that make sense? What questions do you guys have about natural selection types? Okay. The founder effect is going to be on the exam. And what it is, it's basically the selection effect from a big population. So imagine very diverse population living in Europe. Then the subset of that population decided to leave Europe and immigrate to North America and live and reproduce within its own community, not allowing strangers in and not allowing people basically to leave. And this subgroup of population may have had some disease within their gene pool. And as a result, the disease within these colony that reproduced with each other is going to be more prevalent compared to the occurrence of the disease in the general population. So the example I gave here is Ellis van Creveld syndrome in the Amish population in Pennsylvania. So originally the disease was described in Switzerland in the 1700s, but now it's very prevalent in the United States in the certain communities, and that's because that population immigrated to the United States and lived within itself. Like it lived within its own community, limiting the genetic diversity. And as a result, Ellis van Creveld syndrome is more prevalent in this population compared to European population or North American population as a whole. Any questions about founder effect? Okay, so population bottlenecks is going to be on the exam. So population bottleneck occurs if the size of a population becomes greatly reduced. So if the size of the population is greatly reduced, it means that genetic diversity is greatly reduced as well. And as a result, even if the population size is recovered, the genetic diversity would not be because of this population bottleneck effect. So originally, let's say this was the frequency of alleles within a population, or rather diversity of the alleles, but the population was let's say population was hunted down, and the diversity of alleles was reduced from however much there is here colors to 3 colors. And even if the population of the species is restored, the genetic diversity of the population will not be. And as a result, the species will be more prone to extinction in case the environment changes. Okay, does a population bottleneck make sense? Do you guys see a difference between the founder effect and the population bottleneck?
I have a question for the founder effect. Are we losing any alleles through time in that subpopulation because the genetic diversity?
We're not losing any allele. Well, allele frequencies are changing, but I don't think we're losing alleles. We just lost them in the beginning when subpopulation immigrated from the big population, and have not, and alleles are not gained. And they're not really lost.
So is the difference between the founder effect and the population bottleneck is the people who decide to be founders choose to like establish their own colony, and that's the difference? Or
Basically, yeah. So they are similar, but the mechanism, the difference between the two is basically the mechanism how something happens. But both are examples of genetic drift, which is basically the sampling error within the population. Okay, and another thing that is going to be in the exam is homeotic genes. And there are going to be several questions asking like, what's going to happen? I'm not going to go into it, but the question will require knowledge what the homeotic genes are. And homeotic genes are the genes that control the embryonic development. So within an embryo, within the tissue of the embryo around the body, there are going to be like different genes that are going to control the development of like hands, feet, eyes, and so on. So everything that is developed, every structure that is developed on an embryo, that like a fetus, when the fetus is undergoing changes, when the fetus is undergoing like growth and development, what controls this development of limbs, development of other structures are homeotic genes. And if the homeotic genes are not expressed, then we will see defects in the structure of the embryos and adult organisms if the embryos survive. Okay, so that's all I have for today. Do you guys have any questions at all? You're awfully quiet today.
With the homeotic genes controlling the embryonic development, I just have a question based on, so if the genes aren't present, does that mean that mutations can start occurring?
The genes are present. If they're not expressed.
Expressed, I'm sorry, that's what I mean.
Yeah, so if they're not expressed, then we will see some freaky stuff that is going to go on with the fetus. For instance, if the gene that encodes the arm is not expressed, that encodes the formation of the arm is not expressed, then the fetus will not have an arm. Does that make sense, Lauren?
Yes, thank you.
All right, well, please prepare your questions for Wednesday, and I'll see you the day after tomorrow. Don't forget to submit the quiz.